My name is Becky Kazansky. In this video, I'll give you a short introduction to my research and how it ties into the Data Active project. The title of my PhD thesis is What Harms May Come? Exploring the Anticipatory Dimensions of Surveillance Resistance in an Age of Datafication. As people interacting with technologies in an era of datafication, many of us can assume that at any given moment of the day, we may very well be generating data and having that data be processed in a number of different ways by a number of different people, institutions, and algorithms. However, though we can assume the data is being processed about us and we have ample evidence of the harms that can occur with data exploitation and surveillance, it would be impossible to pinpoint what exactly is happening with our data at any given moment with total certainty. That's not just because technology is complex or data collection is ubiquitous, but because the corporations and governmental bodies which collect data about us are rarely keen to give us the full scoop on what exactly is happening. And while strides have certainly been made to make technologies more transparent, this transparency is always a moving target because full transparency often threatens the interests of those doing the data collection. The result is that we continuously live with uncertainty around what kind of data we are generating, how it is being processed, and how it might be used for or against our interests. In the absence of perfect information or accountability, we as individuals and groups are therefore tasked with anticipating, as best as we can, what harm might result from our data being exploited. This anticipation becomes the precondition for surveillance resistance and for the varied responses that different social groups turn to in the face of massive data collection. In my research, I study how people grapple with uncertainty and anticipate harm. Specifically, I study the practices of civil society actors who work to intervene into the uncertainties, threats, and harms of digital surveillance and datafication through a number of different anticipatory practices. Now, when I say civil society, I am referring to an internationally dispersed ecology of NGOs and grassroots groups which, through both collaboration and contestation, develop and maintain an evolving repertoire of mitigations for digital surveillance and related digital threats. By exploring how civil society grapples with the uncertainties of surveillance and datafication, I help answer one of the two main questions of the Data Active project, which in turn is, how do citizens resist massive data collection? To answer these questions, I bring together the study of surveillance resistance and activism with critical studies of data, risk, practice, as well as infrastructure. Disciplinarily speaking, my thesis sits at the intersection of science and technology studies, or STS, surveillance studies, critical data studies, and critical security studies. Throughout my thesis, I explore the temporal and affective dimensions of life under continued potential threat from the actors and institutions that direct biometric surveillance, targeted digital intrusions, preemptive policing, and a milieu of other technological techniques against the interests of social justice groups and human rights defenders. My empirical data is drawn from 50 semi-structured interviews with technologists, educators, and affected communities based in 26 countries. The data also comes from participant observation conducted at 12 international digital rights, internet freedom, digital security, and hacking events in Europe and Southeast Asia. This fieldwork was done between 2016 and 2019. Finally, I also analyzed 120 gray literature texts on security, self-defense, and counter-surveillance, produced since 2007 by NGOs and grassroots groups from around the world. Here I want to explain how my research interests first germinated. From 2009 onwards, I've worked as an action-oriented researcher and educator in matters of digital literacy, privacy-enhancing technologies, and digital security. Over my years in these roles, a recurring question in discussions with other practitioners was how best to break through the uncertainty and overwhelm that come with determining just how to respond as a community to surveillance and data-related harms. In these discussions, I often encountered the common answer that what to do in response to concerns over data and surveillance ultimately depends on your threat model. This is a reference to a practice which helps people break down unwieldy uncertainties into manageable risks, to anticipate future threats, and to prepare for them in response. In my PhD research, I examined practices such as threat modeling as future-oriented anticipatory practices, which enable people to manage uncertainties related to surveillance and data. In my thesis, I trace how and why anticipatory practices like threat modeling have become so important in recent years. But I also turn a critical lens on the consequences of life shaped around the need to continuously anticipate. One of my concerns is with the ramifications of always having to focus on undesirable futures. On the one hand, anticipatory practices enable social groups to put resources towards preparation against probable harms. This is unquestionably important as a practice. On the other hand, the responsibility for modeling threats and risks and responding to them through self- and community defensive practices should be understood as a broader form of responsibilization, an unjust process through which individuals, rather than states or corporations, are bestowed with the weighty responsibility of seeking safety from risks created elsewhere. Because of the kind of injustice that makes resistance necessary in the first place, I believe it is important to ask how certain practices of calculating risks or modeling threats, though meant to foster safety, might also enact political closures around our thinking and our futures. After all, it is one thing to manage a threat, and another thing to abolish its roots. Therefore, my thesis also explores how we can reconfigure safety and security practices to more fully embody the goal of political emancipation. In exploring this question, I foreground the many different ways civil society reconfigures hegemonic practices of security, safety, and risk assessment in order to better reflect the values related to human rights and social justice. I want to end this video on a bright note. Speaking in broad strokes, we live in a time in which technological innovation and its resulting harms seem predetermined and inescapable. However, I strongly believe that in studying resistance to surveillance in its many forms, we are forced to notice that there are always cracks in the wall, so to speak. Technology never does exactly what we want it to. Systems fail and break down in a number of different ways, some anticipated and some not. And this leads me to conclude that our world will never be fixed or perfectly predictable, no matter how many models we make. Therefore, no matter how much big tech companies want to predict our behavior through novel forms of data-driven systems, it's ultimately impossible to eradicate uncertainty, and that is ultimately a good thing. As a scholar and a practitioner, I believe that we must actively embrace social indeterminacy and actively fight the aura of inevitability that surrounds so many technological innovations today. And circling back to my thesis, that is exactly what so many courageous groups and individuals are already doing, as I document. And hence, I want to conclude by expressing my deep gratitude and thanks to them for participating in my research. Thanks.